have lived among for thousands upon thousands of years. It is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Neutral peoples. Today it is home to the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Six Nations of the Grand River, and to many other Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that this land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. This treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee binds them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, settlers, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We all share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, meaning we must take care of the land and the creatures we share it with. We are guided by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's final report, recognizing the urgent importance of the Commission's 94 calls to action in guiding the healing and reconciliation process. We seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one based in honor and deep respect. May we be guided by love and right action as we transform our personal and institutional relationships with our Indigenous friends and neighbors. Good evening, friends. Welcome to the fourth Bird Study Group meeting of the season. I'm Jackson Hudecki, the Bird Study Group Director for the Hamilton Naturalist Club. And welcome to our December edition. I've strung Christmas lights behind me here. Not sure if it's tacky or cool, but I don't care. I'm feeling in the mood. I'm feeling in the festive spirit because it's winter birding action time, and we're going to talk about that shortly. So welcome to the Bird Study Group meeting. If this is your first time with us, let us know in the chat. Where are we reaching you? Where are you in the world? These meetings are virtual. They will continue to be so. We are currently in communication with several venues, but for now, we're going to stick with what's working, and we're going to keep meeting on Zoom for the time being. We meet every month from 7:30 until 9. I usually share some events, some meetings, some other occurrences happening before getting to our special guest, who will give a presentation anywhere from 35 minutes to an hour. There's a Q&A function. There's a chat function. Our guests usually take questions at the very end. So feel free to put them in at any time you think about them, and we'll be sure to cover them before 9 o'clock. Again, if you've never been to a Bird Study Group meeting, these are the general loose goals that we have for one another. Because we're coming inside and at night on a Monday night, we want to keep our mind on birds beyond what we see and hear in the field, to allow for a conversation about bird ecology, threats, efforts, trends, or predictions. We want to amplify the voices of people making a difference, and we want to bring the average person, the beginner birder, the expert birder, all to the same space together, because there's always something to learn. Last month, you heard us talking about the imminence of Bill 23, which has since passed. Now, there is an effort to ensure that there are still portions of it that can be changed, perhaps, if not the whole thing, scrutinized further. The Save Our Streams Hamilton.org group have an emergency meeting planned for tomorrow night, where they're going to be talking to anybody who joins this meeting about certain actions that we can be taking beyond just trying to contact our local MPPs. If you're ready to take the next step, I highly encourage you to visit saveourstreamshamilton.org to tune into this meeting or follow any of their channels, because we're at a point now where we've vocalized, we've submitted petitions, we've signed petitions. Rallies are still ongoing. There's even more to do yet, so feel free to attend that meeting. And to be contacting locally, specifically for Hamilton. I didn't actually look up Halton too much in the last couple hours, but Donna Skelly and Neil Lumsden are two folks who can easily have a bit more pressure put on them, especially if you're from Hamilton. But look up who your local MPP is and consider reaching out to them if possible. Or just scan that code right now, and it will send you somewhere where you can quickly reach out to Donna Skelly. But let's chat a little bit about some birds that we've seen in the area. Many thanks to Marcus Legsdens for providing me this cool shot of a Pomeranian Jaeger that was seen last week. What are you seeing in the HSA? Let us know in the chat if you are chat friendly tonight. It should be activated. Make sure that you're clicking everyone when you are entering something into the chat, or if you've seen any of these birds, let us know. So a northern gannet is I should have put another question mark on that, because since our last meeting, like one showed up, and then a week later into December, someone had reported it on eBird again. So have you seen a northern gannet since our last meeting in December or this winter? Because the winter listing has officially begun for those winter listers out there. Yellow-breasted chat and several warblers, orange crown warbler, yellow rump, Nashville warbler, all being seen in December. But Audubon's warbler being seen even today. That's interesting to see this many warblers, I find, in December. So have you seen a warbler in December? Let us know. Purple sandpiper seen officially. I know it was seen by one birder. It zipped by them. And I think some more folks had eyes on one more recently. Harlequin duck and Barrow's goldeneye are both being seen frequently, especially off 50 point. Snow geese are being reported, as well as sandhill crane. I saw someone sharing a photo of a northern saw-whet owl, so they're starting to make their way to some typical winter spots in the Hamilton Study area, which again, if you're new here to a naturalist club or a bird study group meeting, a 40-kilometer radius from the center of Dundurn Castle is what is considered the Hamilton Study area. Toronto doesn't fall into the HSA, but some folks were lucky enough to go see the Dove Key, which I think was a one-day wonder. And so if you got to see that, congrats. I learned from Marcus that that certain gulls will eat Dove Key. So we were talking about, is it around still? Did it keep moving? Is it somewhere else on the lake? Is it out of the area? Or did it get eaten by a great black-backed gull? And a lark sparrow was seen by two folks in the last, last week. But it was just kind of a 24-hour wonder. So did you see any of these birds? Let us know in the chat. And we're getting near the end of the year. And so I know folks start to really think about, some of the birds that they dipped on if they were birding. Or they're thinking about, what their final number is going to be at the end of this year. So good luck to you as you continue to round out your 2022 year. And then I'm sure you're already starting to think about 2023 and perhaps what your first bird of the year might be or your first outing. So I hope you've had a great 2022 and you have an amazing 2023 birding year. Be interesting to see what birds we've seen when we have our January meeting just from 1 month. So this is where we're going to need you. And this is very important. So I was informed by our good pal Rob Porter that numbers are low for people who are interested in volunteering for any of these bird counts. So if you're waiting or if your plans are coming more to fruition and you can get out into the field on any of these three, all of these three dates, let them know. There's a part of, and I should include this in the chat, and maybe if anyone is tech savvy right now, they can go to hamiltonnature.org, go to the birding section, go to the Christmas bird count section, which is just, there's the hyperlink down there. But there is a kind of Google form you can fill out that you can indicate which of those three dates that you are available on. So if you're able to, on Monday, December 26th, for the Hamilton Study area bird count, that's great. The Flamborough bird count, which I think is only in its second year, if I'm not mistaken, that's on Friday, December 30th. And the Peachtree, I should have put the Peachtree instead of Grimsby, but the Peachtree bird count is on Sunday, January 1st. And that will be a a good day to start your 2023 list off. But yeah, I guess in the last couple of years we had lots of birders out in the field because of COVID and COVID restrictions or fewer family parties, you name it. We had lots of birders out in the field. Um, and so right now, yeah, we've got a low enrollment. So talk to a friend and get out in the field if you can. We're gonna need you. There is an event happening on there are three events happening on one day on January 14th. So if you're part of the Wheelo count, the West End of Lake Ontario IBA count, that's happening on Saturday, January 14th. Chris Motherwell is the contact person for that. cmtrain@cmotherwell.com. You get that whole swath there are the IBAs or the IBBAs in the region. So yeah, I'm sure Chris would love to have you on board with that. There's also a visit to the Vinemount Meadows Sanctuary on that same day from 10 until 11:30. So one of our two employees, Jen Baker, and members of the Sanctuary Committee will be doing a visit to the Vinemount Meadows Road and at the DeFasco Trail. So if you would like to take part in that, or if you want to just ask questions, you can reach out to land@hamiltonnature.org and Jen can share some details with you. Here's a picture of a few folks from the Sanctuary and Land Trust Committee at Vinemount specifically, and this was taken from the Ontario Nature website. So it'd be a cool spot to check out, especially for some cool winter birds. I know that northern shrike like to hang out in that area. So consider going to that outing. And then on that same day, around that exact same time, if you're looking for something that is in the downtown region of Hamilton, there's going to be a tree walk happening with Paul O'Hara. So you can definitely check that out if you aren't able to get out to Vinemount. And this is going to be the last time I'm able to mention this because it's going to start in the new year. So the Niagara Peninsula Hawk Watch is going to be delivering a course on raptor identification, which again is, I've heard great things about it. Keith, if you're out there, I still hope to register, so save a spot for me. But yeah, this is going to be a really cool opportunity to learn about raptors. All of the ones typically that are found or that could be seen coming through here are coming through the Hamilton study area. So it's every Monday and Thursday night in January. So it kind of gets you ready for what you need to know about raptors. So to register, please email the following three things to Keith Deeroff. So kdeeroff@yahoo.ca, your first and last name, your preferred email address, and your e-transfer of $48 to the Niagara Peninsula Hawkwatch. And you're set up after that. Registration closes on New Year's Eve. Are you Christmas shopping? I threw this up last month or some mentions of it last month. Are you supporting local artists? Dave Archbell is a great photographer and an all-around swell guy, and he is selling some calendars for 2023. So this is just lifted from a Facebook post today where he mentioned that there is a selection of calendars for sale at Lulu and Levine Home Studio, 228 Locke Street, in Hamilton, but you can also reach out to Dave and I'm sure he'll be able to share with you some further details about that with a great Eastern Meadowlark. Western Meadowlark from Rainy River. I'm really glad you put that on there, Dave. I don't know if I could even tell you the difference. And local bird, Lewis Millard, is running a kind of a treasure hunt, which they've done before. So Lewis is going to be posting a treasure map at 8 a.m. on Christmas morning. And I think they go and hang up art around Hamilton that you can go and steal. I mean, take it or thieve it. Maybe the same thing. Either way, if you want local art made by a local bird and a bird legend at that, Lewis Millard, you can check out that account for more information. And if you're looking for some cool books or some cool bird paraphernalia, I know that I know that A Different Drummer Books in Halton area sells some cool things, but I was gifted this recently, The Observer's Notebook to Birds from King West Books in Westdale. Some really great information there, as well as a lot of cool birding and bird books and stories pertaining to birds. They're a great supporter of the Naturalist Club, Dave and Tressa, so check out King West Books. Do some shopping, support some local artists this Christmas if you can. And also, there's a really cool spot called Era Crafts. But if you check out Six Nations Tourism and you are in the Brantford area specifically, there are some really cool spots to support Indigenous communities and get some really cool and a lot of the times handmade items. And what could we say about gifts? If we're not talking about becoming a member of the Naturalist Club or buying a membership for a friend for the Naturalist Club, it would be awesome to help support the org to employees and our multitude of sanctuaries that we're preserving and attempting to preserve forever, which may or may not be under threat. So be sure to keep continuing to support the Naturalist Club. Really appreciate the currently 46 of you who are in the Zoom tonight. Much love to you all. Find us on Mastodon, on social media, and across various channels, as well as all of these groups, because there's a lot of community happening in Hamilton, and the birding community is one of them that can be very supportive for a lot of people. So if you're looking for a spot to hone your birding skills, here are a lot of ways you can do so. What did I say, Bob? Oh yeah, well, I'm getting to that. I'm getting texts from Birdman Barry. Major declaration from COP15 in Montreal about global biodiversity commitment. You're right. I didn't have a chance to put that up today, but that is a good commitment. It's time to put boots to the ground. Time to get action going. The reason why I didn't mention Bob Bell is I'll tell you in a second. So next month we're having two earlier meetings in the month that is. So our general meeting, we're going to be hearing from Tegan Netton from Ontario Nature, who's going to be presenting about Tegan is going to be giving us a presentation on species at-risk snakes in Ontario and monitoring efforts. So that's going to be really cool to check out. That's on Monday, January 9th at 7:30 p.m. So really just in a couple weeks. And our next bird study group meeting, Barry Coombs, is going to be one that I haven't done before, where our two guests are going to be authors. So we're going to be having a discussion with Marilyn Simmons and Bob Bell. Marilyn, who is an acclaimed author, and Bob, who is a first-time author, who has written about his life with Lyme disease. Both of these books are for sale, so if you're looking to purchase something or request something or support authors who support the birding communities, purchasing Woman Watching or Out of the Limelight and Into the Sunlight, so that at our next bird study group meeting on January 16th, you can hear from both of these authors, where they're going to be telling us about their books, the inspirations behind both of them, and then we're going to be having a bit of a discussion. So it's going to be a little bit different, and I'm hoping you can attend. So that'll be our next bird study group meeting, and we'll see you there. Okay, enough yammering from me. Bob Bell's book is now available, and I think he said it's available at Wild Birds Unlimited specifically. So that's out in Burlington. So you can go there to purchase it, or tell someone to go there to purchase it. And then while your friend is there buying you that book, they can also perhaps buy you a new feeder or some seed, or heck, even a new pair of binoculars. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to welcome our very special guest tonight. So this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, because it helped kind of start, or at least this bird helped really helped me recognize what birders and what conservationists and what volunteers are capable of when I was hired at the Wasaga Beach Provincial Park and I got to exist within mere feet of a piping plover when I was helping spread some large debris within their enclosure. So this is a really amazing, adorable bird. And so we're going to hear all about it tonight through our special guest, Sydney Shepherd, who is head over heels about piping plovers. She completed her schooling at the University of Guelph in wildlife biology and conservation and at Fleming College in the Ecosystem Management Technology program, also a fellow AUC. While at Guelph, Sydney became obsessed with birds through volunteering with Wild Ontario as a raptor trainer and interpreter. Following graduation, Sydney worked with Ontario Turtles at Risk and loved every second, but always knew she'd migrate back to working with birds. In 2021, Sydney worked as the piping plover student at Darlington Provincial Park and absolutely fell in love with the species. She joined Birds Canada Ontario Piping Plover team just this year in 2022 and is excited to be back on the team for the 2023 field season. I'm super pumped to have you. Friends, let's welcome Sydney Shepherd.
Oh, hello. All right, just trying to turn video on. Perfect. And then I'll share my screen. Thanks for the introduction, Jackson. I'm very excited to be here tonight. As was said in the introduction, piping plover are probably one of my favorite things, so I'm always eager to jump on the opportunity to talk about them. So the presentation called Little Bird, Big World. They are a little bird, but they have a big, big part of my heart, and hopefully after tonight, they might have a big part of yours as well. Right, so just a really quick outline for the presentation. We'll first talk about some piping plover natural history, so get to know a little bit more about the bird. Then we'll talk about some challenges and threats. We'll talk about the Ontario Piping Plover program and the conservation strategies that we use to help these little guys. And then we'll talk about how you can help and end it all off with some questions at the end. But before we dive right into it, I'd like to kind of get an understanding for how many folks in this group might have seen the piping plover or heard of the piping plover before. So if you have the availability to type it in the chat box, where might you have seen a piping plover if you have here in Ontario? I'll wait a couple seconds and just kind of check out that chat and see what we've got there. Oh, I'm not sure actually if I can see the chat, so I'll read those at the end.
We've got Sauble Beach on there from Debbie and Dennis.
Perfect, amazing. Yeah, Sauble Beach has been a very, very important place for piping plover in Ontario here. Any other sites?
Yeah, they're rolling in. And remember, if you're using the chat, click the drop-down function so that it says everyone. Darlene says saw them on Manitoulin Island. Marcus says there was one this year in Hamilton. Margaret says Sauble Beach. Dave says Point Pelee in September. Kevin Empey says Darlington. Louise says Sauble Beach.
Amazing. Yeah, it looks like a lot of folks have seen the piping plover, lots of different spots in Ontario, some also in Hamilton, which is very exciting. And they're not often here in the Hamilton study area. So whenever they do pop in, it's always a special little treat. Has anybody seen them outside of Ontario? Is there any folks who may have seen them on their overwintering ground or maybe even in a different nesting site? Any outside of Ontario? Oh, I see some Florida. Amazing. Yeah, Florida. I would love to see these guys in their overwintering zones because it would mean that I'd be getting some sunshine at this time of year. Awesome. Well, I'm glad that there's lots of folks who have already heard about the piping plover, but we'll kind of dive right into it today. So hopefully you'll learn some new stuff if you've already seen them. All right. So piping plover. They are a small, tiny little shorebirds. They're cute as a button, but they're about the size of my hand, which maybe isn't the best like ID feature, especially for folks out there who might have larger hands than me. But so to put that into context, they're about a little bit smaller than an American robin and larger than most sparrow species. So they're pretty tiny and they do a really good job at camouflaging into their environment. So they've got a sandy colored back, and it's the color of light sand, which is important to note, especially when you're comparing them to some other birds that might look very similar. So sandy colored back, They have one single black breast band that doesn't necessarily connect all the way, especially here in the Great Lakes region. A lot of our piping plover, the neckband doesn't connect in the middle, whereas on the Atlantic coast, their bands do actually connect all the way around, but they've got one single black breast band. They have a orange bill with a black little tip on it. They have a white underside, and they also have really gorgeous orange legs. They're pretty flashy and pretty showy, and they definitely set them apart from some other birds. When they are in flight, you can also see that they have a really nice little white wing bar, and they also fly in a pattern that I like to describe as like a bat, kind of. So when you see them floating across the lake, you might kind of see like a bat-like wing beat. They're not often flying though. More often than not, when you see a piping plover, they'll just be running like this along the beach. And they go so fast too that sometimes like you can't even see their legs moving. It's a very funny thing to watch. And I hope you all get the chance to see them out on the shores. But there's a couple different birds in Ontario here that we often get calls about. They might say, oh, well, we just found this bird and it's nesting. It's laid its eggs in this construction site. I think it's piping plover. You have to come help them. Chances are, if it's in a construction site, it's probably not piping plover, but it's okay. There are a couple other plovers here in Ontario that do confuse folks. So we'll quickly go over those so that there'll be no ID questions in the future. So this one here is a killdeer. Killdeer are plovers as well. They have two black breast bands. I kind of think they look like a bowling pin. That's, I don't know, what I've always sort of pictured. They are a bit darker. They're kind of the color of like mud. I guess really great for camouflaging at a construction site. They have a lot more pale legs, and they're a little bit lankier and less chunky. They're also extremely loud. So one of the questions that we always ask when people call us and the habitat sounds like it might not be a piping plover is we'll ask how loud the bird is. And if it's a very, very loud, sort of shrill, annoying bird, it's probably a killdeer. Piping plover have a very cute little peep low. And for the most part, you have to be very close to the bird to even be able to hear the piping plovers. The other bird that is also in the plover family that looks very, very similar is a semi-palmated plover. These guys are the same size and shape as our piping plover, but there's a couple differences that you can use if you ever see these guys on the shore. So one, they are darker in color as well, the color of dark, like wetter sand. These guys breed up in the high Arctic. And so that substrate up there is a lot more moist and they need to camouflage in there. They also have a darker sort of eye mask. Their face is a lot more black, and that sort of eyebrow forehead stripe connects all the way and then comes up onto their beak. They do also have nice orange legs, but unlike our piping plover, which most likely whenever you encounter a piping plover here in Ontario, they'll have colored bands on their legs. I'll talk more about that later. More often than not, if you see a semi-palmated plover here, they likely will not have color bands on them. There are a couple groups that do place color bands on them, but I've never encountered a color banded semi-palm, but who's to say it wouldn't happen? And then kind of jumping into a separate section of shorebirds, the peeps. This one here is a spotted sandpiper, but just to show you for an example, these guys, again, pretty similar in the size. They do have a lot of a different shape. You can kind of see a more pronounced neck on these guys. They also have a long bill. So that's one thing about plovers. They have like a short little stubby bill. These guys here, the peeps, they have longer bills, which allow them to probe pretty deep into the sand. So that's one way to tell them apart. As well, if you ever see one of the spotted sandpipers, they sort of bounce their tail up and down as they walk along the shore. Piping plover, they do that really fast run, and then they kind of like pause and dive into the sand, and they're very like robotic in their movements. So that's one way you can tell them apart. Now, there are some species here in Ontario and around the world that are sexually dimorphic based on plumage, and it's easy to tell the males and females apart. Piping plover, it's not super easy. There's a couple clues that we have that we've figured out, but they're not the most reliable. But some things that we look for to tell males and females apart is we'll look at the bill. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see this is a male named Worsley. Worsley, his beak is black and it almost stops and then transitions into orange. Whereas here on the right, this is actually Miss Howard, a female bird, and you can kind of see that the transition from the black to the orange is a lot muddier. So that's one way that we sometimes identify males versus females. And then the other way that we use is the black forehead stripe here. In males, it's more often going to connect all the way to their eye. And then in females, there might be a little gap between their eye and that eye stripe. Not necessarily the most reliable for us. As you can see, you kind of have to be pretty close to the birds in order to even see this. So sometimes we just don't know. Sometimes we also just don't know until we watch their behavior, especially during the breeding season. During copulation, we kind of get an understanding as to who's who and who plays a role in doing what. Piping plover are invertebrate lovers. So they eat little tiny invertebrates that are all over the shoreline. They have been seen foraging off of leaves. So some people in the past sort of believed that piping plover might eat vegetation, but they don't. They're only eating invertebrates, little bugs and critters. They have also been seen potentially eating some small minnows, but that's more often in their overwintering grounds. They also do sometimes eat little marine worms, but again, that's more often in their overwintering grounds just because we don't really have marine worms here in Ontario. And then in terms of their habitat, so piping plover, like you and I am sure, love sandy beaches. They like sandy beaches that have a fair amount of vegetation, not too much vegetation. And the vegetation also has to be just right. So it'll be nice and low, not too many tall trees, a nice wide beach too that gives them lots of opportunity to run around and sort of forage in different locations, as well as good cobble is often something that they rely on as a form of camouflage for not only their eggs, but also for their chicks and for the adults even throughout the season. So this is one of our beaches here in Ontario that they've nested at a couple times. This is just north of Wasaga Beach in the tiny township area, technically kind of on like a private property strip, which is pretty cool that they are nesting here on private property as well. And then here you can see a beach that is pretty wide again. It's got some vegetation up at the back. It's pretty great. But here you can also see a rack line. And this is very important for piping plover because this is where they're going to be getting that really good food. So in that rack line, sort of debris will wash in from the lake. And that's where a lot of the invertebrates might be hanging out. So think about those like benthics that might be living in the water and then come onto shore in the dead wooden debris and all the stuff that's washed up. You can also see that there's lots of shells here on this beach. So those might be things from invasive zebra mussels, but also some native mussels that we have here. And those actually play a pretty important role for piping plover nest building as well. So this is a pretty ideal piping plover beach. I'm pretty sure this beach might be a photo of Sauble Beach, which again, we talked at the beginning is a pretty good stronghold for piping plover, or at least has been. We'll talk about that later as well. So just a little timeline for piping plover. When might you see them? Here in Ontario. So they are a migratory species, which means that we only get to see them for a short period of time, which honestly is a little bit sad. I wish I could see them year round. But in April, that's when the piping plover will start returning to the shores here in Ontario. And that's when they need to start getting right to work. So the males end up coming first, and they'll start to establish their territory. So they'll start doing flight displays. And if there's any other male piping plover in the area, they kind of will show off to each other and say, hey, this is my spot. Then the ladies will come around, and that's when the males start attracting the ladies. So they'll do some flight displays. They'll also do some tilt displays where the male will kind of go in front and sort of fan out his tail. I always wonder what's going on in the bird's head. Like, why is this something that they're seeking, that they're doing? It's cute. It's very cute to watch. It just it's not what I would want when I'm choosing a mate. And then they'll also start doing this little dance here that you can see in the photo, and it's called a tattoo dance. So the male is at the back there, and he sticks out his leg and he kicks the lady's butt just like this. And it's, again, super cute to watch. It's very funny. And then that often will lead to copulation. After copulation, nest time is laid. So the male will start to create nest scrapes, and then the lady will start choosing the nest scrape that she likes. and start laying eggs. A full clutch would be 4 eggs. Every now and then, piping plover may lay 3 eggs. They might lay 5 eggs, but 4 eggs is pretty standard. And they lay them right in the sand. So right in the sandy substrate. They will try and decorate their eggs, or sorry, their nest scrapes. So again, they'll bring those shells into the area. They might even bring some extra rocks into the area. But those eggs, if I didn't know what I was looking for, they look just like little pebbles, which can be a challenge, especially, for conserving this species. After about 26 days of incubation, it's chick time. And this is the best time of the year. These little chicks are about the size of golf balls when they first hatch, and they've got little toothpick legs. They are able to run around on the beach just hours after hatching, and they're actually not fed by their parents like most songbirds are. They will feed themselves shortly after hatching. And it's super fun to watch, but also, I mean, look at that thing. It looks super vulnerable. So it's a scary time of year as well. And then after about 23 days, the chicks will be considered fledged. Now, that's sort of the time that we've standardized across our population to say that they're able to fly at this time, and they've sort of passed that most vulnerable state. So at 23 days, we consider that a successful fledged bird, which is great. They might stick around a little bit longer. Most of our birds will stick around into August, just fueling up on some good food. Again, learning how to be a better, stronger bird before they migrate as well. Now, as you can see from this map here, this is sort of their overall range across Canada. So they are migratory, as we said. The blue here on this map is their overwintering locations. So many of the birds will go down to Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, sandy beaches along the coast there. Some of them will go into the Gulf of Mexico here as well. Alabama is where one of my, I won't say that I have favorites, it's hard to choose, but one of my favorite birds, Flash, he goes and overwinters in Alabama every year. A couple go into the northeastern shores of Mexico. And then those lucky birds that get to go down into the Caribbean and the Bahamas, they're just living the life. We have actually 3 distinct populations of piping plover, 2 of which are genetically different subpopulations. So we have the interior subspecies. So that's Chardreus melodus circumcinctus. And then we also have the Atlantic coast, which is a completely different subspecies, Melodus melodus. We are part of the Great Lakes population, so we'll be looking a little bit deeper at that here. In terms of population numbers, the Atlantic coast, they are looking at about 2,000, pairs of birds. The Great Plains population, so the Saskatchewan, Manitoba, that sort of area, they also are about 2,000 pairs. And then here in the Great Lakes, we only had 72 pairs in 2022. So that number is quite different when you compare it. Now, you also might be asking, why are we looking at that in terms of pairs rather than individual birds? And the reason for that is 2 birds are required to reproduce. And in terms of growing a population, reproduction is pretty important. So that's why we're looking at pairs there. Oops, there we go. Yeah, so historically, piping plover in the Great Lakes, we're probably looking at about 500 to 800 pairs, and they nested on all 5 Great Lakes. In Ontario, they would have nested on the shores, on the Canadian shores of Lake Huron, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario. You can see from this map, there's a pretty good distribution here. In the late 1980s, though, that population number dropped substantially down to only about 11 to 14 pairs, and the entire population was just in Michigan. Nothing here in Canada at all, no other states or anything like that. So pretty alarming once we looked at that. Now, why? What happened? Before I kind of get into some of that, there also was many moons ago a hunt out for piping plover feathers. Women used to wear fancy hats with fancy bird feathers, and unfortunately that definitely contributed to a significant initial loss of the population. But there's some other things that we are still seeing here today that also are big threats to their population. So habitat loss. People love beaches. We talked about it in the beginning. The piping plover really, really love nice, wide, sandy beaches. I'm sure when you picture yourself heading out to the beach for a nice summer day, you're thinking of the exact same spot, right? You want like a nice wide beach so that you've got some room to play volleyball, maybe soccer. Of course, you want nice sandy substrate so you can build a sand castle or what have you. And then you want some nice lakes so you can cool off on a hot day as well. This is the same type of habitat that piping plover are looking for. So here in Ontario and really across all the Great Lakes, we try and preserve that habitat for us. So one of the things that we do is we often groom those beaches, kind of till up the sandy substrate, remove any of that woody debris or cobble or anything that might hurt our barefoot, flip-flop feet. So that definitely impacts the piping plover's habitat. Habitat loss also contributes to a whole bunch of other things. So you can see in this photo here that there's a nice dune system in the back here. If we continually keep tilling the soil and grooming the beach, we're going to keep losing vegetation. Vegetation keeps sand in place. And so if that water line is ever to kind of encroach onto the beach more and more, we might start seeing some erosion, and erosion would further deteriorate that habitat, especially when it comes to dune ecosystems, which are super, super rare and super valuable in terms of biodiversity. Here's another photo that you can see. This is a beach in Grand Bend. Piping plover have been at Grand Bend before, and you can see that there's vehicle tracks there. So many moons ago, and it still does happen now again today, but many, many moons ago, places like Grand Bend and Sauble Beach and Wasaga Beach even, vehicles would just be able to drive on the sand, park there for the day. They'd rip up and down there, just kind of continually destroying that habitat and that beachy spot. But also that means that any birds that are running up and down the shoreline really don't stand a chance, especially if you consider that they may already have a nest established here. And you can't see those little sandy, those pebbles that are nested in the ground there. So nests were destroyed accidentally by vehicles being able to drive up and down the beaches and what have you as well. And then again, too, like humans, we want to be on the beach, and us physically being there and taking up space also removes space from the piping plover and their ability to establish nests and successfully raise their chicks. This is a picture pre-COVID at Sauble Beach, but after COVID especially, we've seen more and more people flock to beaches, which is good. You know, we need that sort of sunshine and the cooling off that our Great Lakes provides to us and the valuable ecosystem services and recreation services that beaches give. But sometimes it can be hard to find that balance between land for humans and as well land for piping plover. Another big threat that piping plover face are predators. So this little chick here, you can see cute, tiny, just a couple of days old, and a chicken nugget in the eyes of a gull or a raccoon or a mink. There's many predators that are on our beaches that would love to just eat a little tiny piping plover chick. And it's honestly pretty sad. Always hard to see so many predators around on our beaches. As well, humans, we are kind of influencing the predator dynamics. So gulls are one of the #1 sort of predators that we see on our shores, whether that be herring gulls or ring-billed gulls. They're all out there and they're all hungry. And because of human recreation on those beaches, you know, we're coming to the beach and we're eating food and we might accidentally leave some of our garbage or purposefully, or we might, you know, feed the gull because what's one French fry? It's funny. But that encourages more gulls to be around our area on the beaches, higher abundance, higher density, and that definitely impacts piping plover. We're very lucky that our adult piping plover are wonderful parents, and this little guy here, you can see tiny, tiny little adult piping plover bird taking on a gull, way bigger than he is. So they're pretty ferocious parents, and they'll definitely take, well, they won't take down a gull, but they'll show the gull who's boss. So we're lucky in that regard, but it is still it's still hard. And you can see from this next photo too, that gulls will often find themselves just loafing in our area. We sometimes accidentally create like a nice refuge for them in some of our conservation strategies, which again, I'll talk about a little bit more. But gulls are one thing. We also have quite a few other predators on our beach. So raccoons, they really like to eat piping plover eggs, foxes, skunks, sometimes even domestic cats. Domestic cats have taken down adult piping plover here in Ontario, and I'm pretty sure in other places in the population, they've also been recorded damaging nests. So domestic cats, not super fun for piping plover and many other bird species as well. And another threat that piping plovers see are extreme weather events. So this is a picture from Darlington Provincial Park in 2020, I believe. And you can see on the left-hand side, that's the lake. On the right side, where you see that little puddle, that's actually just washed up area from a storm that came in a few days prior. Where the gulls are sort of loafing there in the back, that's where the nest was established. So the nest actually washed out twice that year due to high water levels from the storm. And that one's a little bit trickier because that's not necessarily human influenced, whereas the other ones are a little bit easier to, work on some conservation initiatives because they are mostly directly related to human activity. This one is a little bit trickier, but it's something that we do have to keep in mind. There are also lots of other threats and challenges to piping plover that I have not touched on today. There's just so many sometimes that it's easier just to cover a few, but things like botulism, which is increasing with the rising temperature of our Great Lakes, and with climate change as well. That's something that we have to be aware of with piping plover and their populations. So now all those threats, it's a lot and it's overwhelming. And, we can get bogged down about it. But I think that there's so many things that we can do, and there's always a bright side to look on. And that's where the Ontario Piping Plover program comes in. So before we kind of dive into our program, it's important to note that since piping plover returned to Ontario in 2007, there has been on-the-ground efforts to conserve piping plover from various organizations and individuals. Without them, it would be a completely different story. And that also goes all across our population. So not just here locally in Ontario, but also especially Michigan. They've done such an incredible job at working really hard for this species. But the Ontario Piping Plover program, run by Birds Canada, came to be in 2018. And we sort of coordinate the efforts across all of the province. We're working with those various partner organizations and making sure that we're all working cohesively together with the same goal in mind. And we use various conservation strategies, and we'll kind of dive into those now. So one of the big ones, and many folks who said that they've seen piping plover on our shores have probably seen this, we'll use symbolic fencing. Now, we sometimes call it psychological fencing or symbolic fencing. The fencing is not for the birds, of course, it is for us, it's for the humans. So we set up a perimeter on the shores when we see that a nest has been established. So one singular egg is enough for us to come onto the beach and start protecting that area for them. We will put out some signs that say, endangered species, piping plover area. We also have some larger signs that have some more in-depth information. So folks who are coming to the beach and who've never heard of piping plover before can do a little bit of learning. But an area of 50 meters on either side of the nest is protected. It's a good chunk of land, but it is also the area that's been shown to be needed for the success of being able to incubate their eggs without much disruption. And so this actually leads to more success in hatching. We also use predator exclosures. So here you can see predator exclosure being used. And when people see this on the beach too, they always think, oh, well, you've trapped the bird in there. You can kind of see in the second photo on the right there. Those little areas are big enough that the birds can actually come in and go freely, but no grubby raccoon paws or anything like that can make their way in there. So it's just the right size for birds to come and go, but especially not any larger avian predators or mammals or anything like that. So when one egg is laid, we put out a miniature exclosure, which is the one that you see on the left here. It's a small little caged area, and we use the miniature exclosure because at one egg, the adults are still a little bit iffy. They're not like super dedicated to their nest yet. So we don't want to put in a larger exclosure and stress them out further, potentially leading to any abandonment of their nest. So we put this one in, and then once we get 4 eggs laid in the nest, we put out a larger predator exclosure. So this one gives them a lot more room, especially gives a lot more room so that those mammals can't really get any long paws in there. They're able to go in and move around freely. Up at the top here, this is some butterfly netting. So again, blueberry netting. So again, it doesn't allow any of those avian predators to get in through the top, but our birds can go in and out as they please. It's very cute. Piping plover, they have shared parental duties during incubation. So they often have different understandings. Each couple has a different understanding, but from what I've seen, it's often about an hour interval. So, the female might sit on the eggs for an hour while the male's off foraging, and then they come in, switch, and then the female will go off to forage and come back. It's very fun. It's very cute. And the predator exclosures have been linked to a pretty decent success rate all across the country. So that's great. One thing is that, unfortunately, we have some pretty smart raptor species and corvids. And sometimes they clue into these predator exclosures, actually. So on Toronto Island, where there's quite a few raptors, we did not use a predator exclosure this year, and we still saw success in our nest, which was good. But previously on Toronto Island, we saw that our smart birds were queuing in, and they were actually hanging out near the predator exclosure, trying to potentially take out one of our adult piping plover. We also do banding and research. So we don't know a lot about the migration of piping plover. We kind of know where they go just based on submissions of people who are down there and who see them. But if it weren't for banding, that's something that we wouldn't know. We're also hoping to do some increased research in the future, putting MODIS tags on our adult birds so that we can track them as they migrate along. But when our chicks are about 7 to 10 days old and they're still not able to fly yet, we will capture them on the beach and put colored bands on our bird. And the colored bands are great because we're able to identify each of them as individuals. So not only can we identify them, when they're in their overwintering grounds or what have you, but when there's a full brood of 4 chicks running around the beach, each one of them can be distinguished by themselves. So this here is a chick from Darlington in 2020, I believe. And this one you can see on the orange band here has a yellow dot. So the entire nest would have got the same band combination. So they all would have been X, which is the aluminum band here, blue, orange, blue, but this one here has a yellow dot, whereas the other ones in the nest would have been red dot, green dot, or blue dot. And when people see these color bands all over, so again, in their wintering ground or at Point Pelee or in the Hamilton study area, they will send those colored bands to us and they'll say, hey, we saw this bird. And then we're able to come back to them and say, oh, amazing, that bird was nested, has nested previously at Sauble Beach for this many years, or it hatched from Michigan in 2016. And all this information is tied to these birds because of their color bands. The banding process only takes about 5 minutes. It's super quick, and we try and release them back to their parents as quick as we can so that we don't cause any unnecessary stress. But again, the information that we gain from these bands is so valuable. And also for what we do here in Ontario, it's pretty fun. All of our birds, we know them as individuals. They all kind of have little nicknames, and that's because we know who they are when they arrive based on their color bands. And we also do a lot of outreach and education. So we do various events throughout the year. This photo is from an event called Plover Palooza, which we do at Wasaga Beach, and we're hopefully going to do at some other beaches in the future. And our goal here is just to talk to the general public, the people who are on the beach and potentially interacting with the birds, sort of talk about some strategies that they can do, and some making sure that they know proper beach etiquette when it comes to being on piping plover beaches. And it's very fun. It's awesome talking to the public. A lot of folks don't know that there are endangered species right here in Ontario, and especially in some of our busiest places in Ontario. So that's always a very, very fun conversation to have. And then we also do daily nest monitoring with the help of not only staff, but our volunteers. So we have a large volunteer corps at all of our breeding beaches, and they help us to learn more about our birds. You know, they're looking for things like the amount of predators that are on the beach. So how many gulls did you see today? Were those gulls hanging out in this area? Is that something that we can potentially mitigate in the future? A couple of years back at Darlington, they found that there was a mink that was getting pretty frisky and pretty close, and it actually, unfortunately, did predate on one of our chicks. It was kind of waiting around in the same area. So we put up some mink fencing as a mitigation strategy there, and that's something that we wouldn't know unless it were for daily monitoring. We also, you know, we don't have garbage cans on our beaches in the piping plover area, and that's because we're able to see that there's higher predator density on those beaches because of things like daily monitoring. So it's pretty awesome. And it's super fun. You get to be out on the beach in the sunshine, just really enjoying everything. It's good times. And then captive rearing is another strategy that we use. So this here is Flash. I talked about him earlier. He's, again, maybe my favorite. But Flash, you can see on his leg, on his orange band, it's got like an extension to it. So we call that a flag. Birds that are captive reared were born in captivity and sort of raised in captivity and then released into the wild after they're a certain amount of days old. They receive an orange flag so that we can distinguish them against other birds. Now, not all birds that have orange flags are captive reared. Also, rebanded adults in the States sometimes get orange flags, but we know his story. Captive reared birds will get that nice little orange flag. So how do birds get captive reared? Well, if nests are abandoned by the adults for whatever reason, maybe, you know, there was a predation event of one of the adults, and so it's a single parent, and they've decided that it's too much effort and energy for them to just put into incubating the nest by themselves. They might abandon that nest and try and find a new partner elsewhere. Or if it's high water level, or if there's too many humans on that beach and they just don't think that it's the right spot for them to raise their eggs, they might abandon the nest. With special permits, we are able to come in and collect those eggs, bring them to a captive rearing facility that is in Michigan at the Detroit Zoo. And they have an amazing facility. It's so cool. They incubate the eggs, raise the chicks in this outdoor protected exclosure so they can learn how to be real birds. And then they release them with wild hatched birds so they can, again, sort of learn the intuition things that the birds would need to survive. It's very cool. It's not something that happens a lot. In 2022, we only had 10 captive birds released into the population, but 10 birds is still a pretty good amount. So it's the captive rearing program is very cool. And this is just a photo of 3 little captive reared birds ready to be released into the wild. You can see they're just super cute, super bright-eyed, ready to go. Okay, so we talked about some conservation strategies. Now, what's going on? Is it working? How are we doing? So again, in the late 1980s, this is their population, 11 to 14 pairs, only in Michigan. What are we looking at today? So in 2022, not too bad, eh? We had 72 pairs in 2021, and they're making their way around. So on the Ontario side of things, we had nests in Lake Huron, Lake Ontario. Sadly, we have not seen nesting back on Lake Erie, on the Canadian shores of Lake Erie, but I think that we're pretty close to that. In 2022, we had birds check out Point Pelee for an extended period of time. We had birds check out Rondeau. We had birds down at Long Point. And these were all sightings for only a couple of days. But the fact that they're coming to these beaches and checking out the habitat, it's pretty exciting stuff. And you can see that on the state side of things, they're hanging out in more than just Michigan. So again, that's really good to see. In terms of their population numbers, it's a little bit different. This is just Ontario since 2007. So there was a 30-year gap where we didn't have piping plover here at all. In 2007, one pair returned to Ontario and successfully nested at Sauble Beach. So you can see that here. So this is pairs in the blue bar, fledglings. So again, birds that survive past 23 days will be considered fledglings, and that's the red bar there. Over the years, we've had quite a few successful years, some not so successful years, some mildly successful years, but we're super happy with what's been going on. This yellow bar here shows you the recovery goal for productivity. Now, productivity is fledglings per pair. So how many birds were successfully raised by pairs all across the province, and it's just an average number. But this number really gives us a good idea of how successful each year was. Then you can see from the green bar there, there's quite a few years that have reached that productivity goal. We're really happy to see that. This year in 2022, we reached that productivity goal with 2 fledglings per pair, which again is really great to see. Now, 2020, what was the deal there? So in 2020, we had 6 nests, technically 5, but I'll get to that as well. We had 6 nests across Ontario. So that's 6 breeding pairs. And we had 12 total fledglings. So that gives us a productivity rate of 2 fledglings per pair. Now, what's going on with Darlington Provincial Park there, you might ask? And this is my favorite story. So Darlington Provincial Park this year, we saw in the early season 2 female birds stop by on the beach. One's name is Chewy and one's name is Miss Howard. Chewy and Miss Howard were just exploring the beach, sort of waiting for a male to come around. Last year too, they actually had some interesting dynamic where those 2 ladies, as well as another ladybird, 086, shared one male. It's not really typical. More often than not, piping plover are monogamous, so they will be a breeding pair throughout the breeding season. But they shared a man last year, and this year they waited around a little bit, but no man ever came. So they just decided to take matters into their own hands, I guess. And Chewy and Miss Howard, 2 female birds, were seen doing courtship displays and scraping a nest and attracting each other to that nest. And then eventually we were on the beach and we just found eggs from 2 female birds. It first started with Chewy. She was laying some eggs. And then eventually we saw that Miss Howard ended up adding to that nest as well. So we found a total of 6 eggs in that nest. And again, at 4 eggs, the parents will start switching and kind of giving full incubation duties. And Miss Howard and Chewy were switching out. They were incubating. They were a true power couple. Unfortunately, their nest was abandoned after the Mother's Day really high wind storm. I'm not sure if anybody remembers that this year, but their nest was laid pretty close to the shoreline. The eggs likely would have washed out. And Miss Howard, she did go missing. We're not entirely sure what happened, but we are suspected that she was predated this year. And so Chewy decided, no, not worth my effort. And we collected those eggs again under permit, and we candled them and found that they were infertile, but just the fact that 2 ladybirds were sharing a nest together, incubating together, it still warms my heart, and I love it a lot. Now, Chewy did move on to Toronto Island, and she did find a man. His name is now Han, and she was able to successfully raise a nest. So that's great for Chewy, but just a very fun story there. So yeah, really great, successful 2022 season. We were on 2 Ontario lakes, and yeah, pretty great. Now, how can you help? What can you do to give love to our piping plover? Well, the number one is that when you're on our beaches, on our breeding beaches, even if you're not on piping plover beaches, just obey the rules and regulations. So a lot of those rules might be in respect to signage and fencing area. So if you're on a breeding beach, just give the plover some space. There potentially is no dog rules on beaches, or keep your dog on a leash on beaches, those types of things. If you're in a nesting beach, respect those nesting areas. So make sure that you're giving those birds some space. You're not going into those nesting areas. If the shoreline is open, you're quickly walking by the shoreline just to give the plovers lots of time. You're not lingering and kind of stressing them out or anything like that. Of course, leave no trace when you're on the beach. So if you bring any food or garbage, bring that back out with you. We don't want to encourage any additional predators to be in that area. And then, of course, get involved, volunteer, and spread the word. We do need volunteers at all of our breeding beaches. For 2023, we're not entirely sure where the birds will show up, but some of our areas that we're pretty sure will need some volunteers would be Darlington, Presqu'île, Wasaga, Sauble. Now, I know most of you folks are probably from the Hamilton area here, but maybe you have cottages. Maybe you're visiting one of those beaches for a week or something like that, camping, and you've got a week. The volunteer commitment isn't too big at all. We really only ask for about a 2-hour shift, once a week or a couple times a month if you can. So if that's something that you're interested in, let us know. Check out our website. And if you can get involved, that'd be awesome. Or if you know somebody who would like to. And spread the word. So today, maybe you learned a little bit more about piping plover. And you can take that and run with it and give it to somebody else. But spread the word. Tell everybody how cute these little birds are and what they can do to help. If you're looking for more piping plover content, and I mean, who wouldn't be? The Warblers podcast, which is produced by Birds Canada, does have a few episodes on piping plover, and in specific, more details on the Chewy Miss Howard female-female pairing. So definitely check out the Warblers podcast piping plover episodes, as well as all their other episodes. The podcast recently just won the Nature Inspiration Award for 2022. Andrea, who's the coordinator of the Piping Plover program, she also hosts the Warblers podcast, so it's definitely worth checking out. So the Piping Plover program, here's some of our information. We work with incredible partners across the province. We would not be able to do our work without the hard work of these folks. We're also on social media, so Twitter, Facebook, Instagram at Ontario Plovers. If you're looking for any information about how you can get involved, volunteering, anything like that, check out the Birds Canada website. So that's birdscanada.org. And thanks everybody for listening to a little presentation about, again, the most wonderful birds, cutest birds on the planet. And I'll take some questions now.
Woo! Thank you so much. For folks who wouldn't know this, but that was your first presentation. That was your first time presenting on piping plover to the public.
I mean, I've been involved with piping plover for 2 field seasons now. So a lot of the outreach that I've done is shorter stints right on the beach, just casual chats with beachgoers. So yeah, this was my first Zoom piping plover thing for sure, and first a little bit longer presentation about piping plover.
Well,
so thanks for having me.
Yeah, super honored that that this happened here with the Hamilton Naturalist Club. That was an amazing presentation, so thank you so much. And let's get to some questions. So I guess one of the things I was thinking about was how, for birders in Hamilton, because a few of us were chatting, and this might come up either in the chat or in the Q&A. But Hamilton and Burlington have been designated bird-friendly cities through Nature Canada, and we were talking about ways of continuing to increase habitat. And along one of our beaches specifically, we were thinking about like how to talk to the city or the municipalities about refraining from raking. So that the beaches could look more attractive to something like a piping plover. So my question is twofold. One is, do you have any advice for perhaps talking to municipality? But the other one is more bird specific. How long, seeing a piping plover on a beach, how long would we expect to see them before we think there could be nesting potential?
Yeah, no, great question. I guess going to the first one first. I should also rephrase this. Beach grooming is not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a practice that we use here on our piping plover beaches as a way to conserve that habitat for them. It's just that we need to figure out how to better manage the grooming practices, and like, what time of year should we be grooming our beaches? How often? How deep should the rake be going? Some things like that have to be considered. So on a lot of our breeding beaches, we do actually groom after the plovers have gone. They're confirmed gone at the end of the season. They'll do one really quick light rake, and that's actually just so that vegetation doesn't encroach on their habitat. So too much vegetation for the piping plover can be a bad thing. And that's things like dense beach grass or dense alders and poplars and those types of willows that might be out there. So not necessarily a bad thing, but the way that we do it traditionally on a lot of our beaches for human recreation doesn't support piping plover very well. And I think that really the best way to do it, and a lot of beaches are taking steps forward in doing that, is trying to figure out how can they create like a best management practice and a framework that they can work within. If there's erosion, especially like heavy erosion on your beach, and you can send photos of that and talk about the value of dune ecosystems, that often kind of leads into protection of piping plover habitat anyways, or hopefully habitat that will then support piping plover. And then if a piping plover ever nests there, well, that would be just our lucky day, because then that habitat would get some protections in that way. But yeah, I think, talking about just better management, we're not cutting it. We're not saying people can't enjoy nice beaches as well. I'm just trying to find that balance, and so putting a monetary value to our ecosystem services is very helpful.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because I know there has been quite the controversy, especially in the Sable area.
Yes. Yeah, I actually kind of glazed right over that today. That's all
Which is
right.
fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it just goes to show that there's potential for a lot of relationship building between grassroots movements or conservation minded organizations and municipalities.
Absolutely. And one thing that we are hoping to do more of in the future, we haven't done a lot of habitat work. A lot of the stuff that we do is active while the birds are physically there. But we're hoping to partner with the Lake Huron Coastal Center and sort of learn more about conservation of habitats, about planting marram grass to reestablish dune ecosystems and potentially Phragmites removal and all those types of things. So working out with organizations that are already doing this work and have that knowledge and whatnot to bring that sort of extra power to the table.
Great. That's amazing. Because yeah, I think we're at a stage now where it seemed like things were all going in a really good trajectory. And then as of like a month ago, now we don't really know what the future is going to hold.
Yeah.
And we're going to need even more people power moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, we just really have to rally together, but do it.
So I'll go back to my second question of the two-parter. So a birder encounters a piping plover on a beach. What are we looking for to determine whether or not they're looking at viability for a potential scrape site?
Yeah. So I mean, the best thing that you're looking for would be two birds. One bird, they might stick around for a couple days. I know in the Windermere area, is that correct? There's often been singular piping plover, and there's potential in that area, but it's pretty busy. There's a lot of dogs from what we've heard, and off-leash dogs especially. So those individual birds might not stick around long enough for a second bird to be attracted to that area. But when you do see two birds, especially giving them lots of space and then watching their behavior. So are they doing any tilt displays? Piping plover, when there's two of them, they'll often do a thing called a parallel walk. So there'll be two birds that will be side by side, and they kind of just walk. And that's them essentially establishing their territory, which is fun to watch. But just reading their body language, and in those early stages, they're not thinking about much other than like, let's get down to business. So they're eating, but they're doing their fancy stuff as well. So
If I could throw a skill testing question at you, then what is that window of their mating time like?
Yeah, so most of the time the birds will arrive late April, and then we're looking at nests established pretty early in May. So it might be a 2-week period. Once copulation starts, we often find that the nest will come about 7 days later.
Cool. Um, that's awesome. Thanks for that. Okay, so while some folks are vacating, they're leaving some overwhelming response in the chat for how great your presentation was. So we'll take a look at that after. So you talked about the subspecies. So I, yeah, I guess I never really thought about this. You were calling them the Great Plains. Um, you seem to show three. You said there's like an Atlantic, there's a Great Plains population, and then a Great Lakes. Are there three? Are there two? Do they
So
overlap?
there's three, yeah, three populations, but two subspecies. And so it's kind of confusing because for the most part, a subspecies and a population, they might be considered like those would be synonymous terms. There's not actually a lot of interbreeding between the Great Plains population and the Great Lakes population, but they are still the same subspecies. They're the interior subspecies, and then the Atlantic birds are more genetically distinct and therefore a different subpopulation.
Um, can you speak to the monitoring efforts that are occurring in the Great Plains or the Atlantic coast? Like, are you helping oversee all of it? Are there other teams dispersed around?
Oh yeah, so Birds Canada does have some Atlantic folks as well who are looking at piping plover as well as some other shorebirds. We don't do, as far as I know, I don't think we have a distinct piping plover program for the Great Plains, Birds Canada, but there are many different organizations, government agencies, NGOs that are all working across across North America to really bring back these birds and kind of reestablish these birds in their historical nesting areas. For the most part, those would be the U.S. does a lot, which is really great to see. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does a really great job. A lot of the birds, lucky for them and for us, often will nest in national parks. So the Park Service also does a fair amount of work in those spaces. But yeah, across everywhere. In Canada, both populations are considered endangered. In the States, the Great Plains population actually isn't considered endangered, so they get some different legislation and whatnot. Yeah, lots of folks with their toes in the water and doing good work.
That's amazing. And great to hear. Super empowering. So Barry wondered if the subspecies will attempt to nest outside of their described territories.
So likely not. In terms of mixing between the subspecies, because we color band all of the Great Lakes piping plover, we're able to see if they pop up in other spots. Every once in a while, somebody from the Great Plains might come into Ontario or into the Great Lakes area, and I think we've had 1 or 2 birds in the past couple of years that have added to genetic diversity, which is great. But mostly they're sticking to their breeding zones and they're not going elsewhere. We really also don't see any birds from the interior going out to the Atlantic coast like that. That just doesn't really happen too much, which again is why they're so genetically distinct, those two populations.
Very cool. Thank you. David says, is there any record of piping plovers on the north shore of Superior? It seems like a logical area for expansion from North Michigan.
Yeah, so there hasn't been, and even in the historical records on the North Shore, not so much. There's a small population in Lake of the Woods area in Ontario, like basically right at the Manitoba border there. But it's not often monitored, so sometimes it's remote, we don't know. But the habitat doesn't really seem to be there. It's a little bit rockier up there. You know, you can kind of picture the shield, the Canadian Shield, kind of scoping through that area, and it's not really the same sandy beaches that we have down in this area.
Interesting. Thank you. So, Rohale wonders, do you often see new unbanded piping plovers on the beaches, maybe from another population?
Yeah, so
Great Lakes
not often.
Yeah.
Not often at all, but this year, in September at Point Peely, there was an unbanded piping plover, a juvenile piping plover, so it would have just been born this past summer, that was kicking around for quite a long time. And so that signals to us that there likely was a population somewhere in the Great Lakes. Maybe it was here in Ontario, but it could have been elsewhere in the population that went undetected. And therefore that bird was unbanded, because in the Great Lakes right now, we are banning every single known piping plover pair so that we're able to get that information from them. There could be, again, a chance that bird may have came down from the Great Plains. They don't do the same banning initiatives that we do to the same sort of degree and intensity. So there's a lot of questions about that individual bird for sure. So, you know, every now and then, but yeah, we'll see what happens.
Cool. Rohale also asks in that same question, do piping plover usually return to the same breeding grounds every year?
They do. So if a piping plover feels that they had success in the previous nesting season, they're likely going to return to that same beach the following year. When they feel success, they're like, yes, this spot was good. And now that also kind of goes with the monogamous thing. Piping plover are technically monogamous for the breeding season, but they're not monogamous for life. So they might return to that same beach the following year, the male per se, and he might find a different lady than he had last year. And he's just going to get down to business and start working. So he's not waiting around for the same female that he had the year before. They're pretty opportunistic in that way. But yeah, again, if they feel success, they will return to the same beach. And often they're nesting pretty close to where they did like years prior. We'll take GPS points of the nests each year, and we find that like eggs are dropped in very close proximity to what they have been in the past sometimes.
How do they know? You know, like,
right? So many questions.
Crazy.
And there's so many questions about all the how do they knows. So young birds, they don't migrate with their parents. How do they know where to go? Like they just fly south and birds are cool.
Speaking of flying south, there's a couple of things in the chat. So Marianne says, great presentation. When they migrate, do the subspecies go to the same winter grounds? So where they're not coming in contact in breeding grounds, do they meet up somewhere down south? And where is that?
Yes, so there is a little bit of overlap or more overlap of the subspecies down on the wintering grounds. But that said, there is still some preference, I guess you could say, with the subspecies and where they decide to overwinter. So the Great Plains population, they're sticking a little bit more to the interior. So they're heading down to the Gulf of Mexico, potentially Mexico, but Texas, Alabama, more to the west. Our guys, they're pretty like in the Florida, Georgia, South Carolina area. And then the Atlantic province, they'll also go down to that area, but they'll also kind of head out to the Bahamas. I don't think too many of the Great Lakes population have been seen in the Bahamas. Again, that's more the Atlantic province, but there is a little bit of intermingling down there. So they're not doing anything, so it's not increasing their genetic diversity, but they are all hanging out together, which is kind of cute to think about.
I love it. That's great. Rohale says, not exactly a question, but would you say that the chicks being able to feed themselves almost straight from hatching has been really conveniently helpful for their resilience and population growth, since the eggs that are incubated in captivity and reintroduced back in the wild with other chicks aren't dependent on parents taking responsibility for them?
That is a good question. It's tricky. I mean, the fact that our birds are precocial and can feed themselves right after they hatch is great. They're learning a lot. They're getting big and strong. But on our beaches here, where there is a lot of human influence, they often do spend a lot of time not foraging. And they're actually not getting as big and strong necessarily on a lot of our beaches here, because they might have to spend time hiding from a predator or a dog off leash or humans walking along the shoreline. In captivity, those birds, again, don't have a lot of those external pressures. So they might be getting bigger and stronger faster. So I hope that answers the question, but that's one thing that we think about when it comes to our conservation initiative. So we try to close the shoreline once our birds have hatched, so that we're able to provide those birds an opportunity to forage without disruption, so they can get bigger, stronger, faster. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And that sounded like you answered it pretty well. Last question is from Debbie and Dennis. Are people overwhelmingly supportive of the piping plover recovery efforts on our beaches?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite parts of my job, I think, is talking to folks right on the beach about these birds and about, first of all, I just tell them how cute they are, and then they speak for themselves, those birds. But yeah, I mean, people love to see what we're doing. They love to see the volunteers out there on the beach, get to know the volunteers, learn their story, and all that kind of thing. And every once in a while, we'll talk to somebody who maybe isn't too happy about, the piping plover gets a fenced off area all to themselves, and I'm crammed on this beach playing volleyball beside another volleyball court or what have you. But for the most part, I think that there's a lot of good people out there, and those people, they're good people. So yeah, people love plovers, and it's good to hear.
Yeah. And again, when I started working at Wasaga Beach and got to meet a lot of folks and helped kind of put up some of the fencing and then stand there and chat with folks walking by, you see them like, what are you doing here? What is this? What's going on? And then as soon as you start telling them, they're like, oh, yeah, you want to see it in the scope? Yeah. And then they're looking at the scope, and that's like their first time seeing the bird, and watching them just like, then they're on board. You're right. So
yes. Yeah. And we had a nest at Toronto Island this past year. Every now and then we kind of get one there. And the fact, like when people learn that there's an endangered species nesting downtown Toronto, it blows their mind and it shifts everything. And they just become not only attached to the bird, but attached to the greater environment, like from that moment. So piping plover are like the gate into the rest of conservation as well, which is really cool.
So there's, again, I'm going to encourage you to maybe scroll through or when we're done, just read through, because, as I mentioned, I thought that was a great chat, and so does everybody else. So, that was killer. I usually like to ask this of my presenters, what is the end of, what does this year in birding look like for you? Aside from the plovers, what does engaging with nature look like for Sydney Shepherd?
I love shorebirds for sure. I think that a lot of the birds that I flock to are water type birds. This past year, I actually did a little bit of work on the East Coast with Leach's storm petrel, and so I became a seabird person momentarily, and then I had to come back to Ontario. But I want to be out on those beaches in the wintertime looking for the birds, the wet birds. I love them so much. So the gulls, the winter ducks, the wonderful winter ducks down at the canal. Cannot wait. I haven't been out there yet, but the rest of the season, winter ducks, that's what I'm looking forward to.
Cool. If you ever wanted to do like a co-sponsored event, we are running winter events. So if you wanted to do, but that's a professional thing. If you're just kind of flying under the radar down here, just enjoy some peace and quiet, but keep that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love working with Birds Canada. Rohail said that you did answer their question quite nicely. They want to know, after spending so much extensive time and learning about plovers, do you ever get bored of how cute they are?
No, actually, slightly embarrassing story, but why not share it with the internet? A couple of weeks ago, I was just sitting on the computer, doing some email, and I was looking for a photo for whatever reason of my birds. I get to look at them even in the wintertime almost every single day through photographs. But I found this photo of a piping plover chick, and I was overwhelmed by how cute it was in that moment that I just sat there and I cried. It doesn't get old, and I've only worked with them in the field for 2 seasons, but I am so incredibly excited for this upcoming spring again for the hatchlings to be out there, because just watching these little cotton balls with toothpicks run, like there's no feeling in the world that is better than that, I think. And it will not get old. I know it won't.
Well, I hope to have you back sometime down the road, or I hope to continue hearing about your great work and the work that Birds Canada and others are doing out there, because it really does go a long way. And whether these birds never know it or not, like they're, wondering what these enclosures are, and then they're like, "Oh, dang, this is kind of nice." You're doing
I think they like it. I think they do.
yeah. Yeah. You're doing huge things out there. So thanks for putting in the time, putting in the effort, and even on a Monday night, coming to talk with all of us. Michael will be drafting this up and putting it in the wood duck in the next little while, but keep up the great work. And thanks for sharing your tearful moment with us, because now we're all not only bonded by the plovers, but we're bonded in our love for wildlife.
Yes, absolutely. No, thank you so much for having me, and all the folks in the chat there with your wonderful questions and also your support. It's great to see. So thank you all.
So follow Ontario Plovers on social media if you haven't already. Follow Birds Canada and listen to the podcast. I've listened to almost all of them. I didn't know anything about the Leach's Storm Petrel until I listened to that podcast. It's crazy. These stories are
They're a wonderful bird too. They're a very cool bird.
So lots to be had out there, folks. On behalf of the Hamilton Naturalist Club and the Bird Study Group, Sydney, thank you once again for coming out. And to everyone else, enjoy the last remaining days of 2022. And the next time we see each other will be next year. So get on the Christmas bird count. Stay birdie, stay safe. See you, everybody. Bye, Sydney.
Bye, folks. Thank you.